The 19th Amendment, making women's suffrage legal. In this day and age in the United States of America, women can have a job, they can run for president, they can do whatever they want to do and be whatever they want to be. Women are a part of society and are treated as equally as men. Sadly, this wasn't always the case. Back in the beginning of the United States, women had a specific role in society, and it was the complete opposite of what they do today. They couldn't own land, they were looked down on if they did not have a husband, and were basically owned by their husbands. They also could not vote. They didn't get a say in how the country they were living in was run. Women and men fighting to give women the right to vote and to create the 19th Amendment revolutionized how women were viewed and led to women getting the privileges they have today. This topic relates to the theme conflict and compromise in history because the conflict is women wanted to be able to vote and had to fight for their right. The compromise was the creation of the 19th Amendment, which gives women the right to vote. The conflict all started on July 19th, 1848 in Central Falls, New York at Wesleyan Chapel, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organized a gathering to discuss the issue of women's rights. At the gathering, there were 200 women attendees, and during the gathering, men and women signed the Declaration of Sentiments, which outlined grievances and set the agenda for the women's rights movement. After this, the women's suffrage movement escalated, and men and women of both colors joined the cause. The first major action taken by the states regarding women's rights after the first gathering was in 1849, where California granted married women property rights. This meaning that if a woman was married, then they could own land separate of their husbands. This was the first major change in the United States, which made women and men equal. In 1850, the first ever National Women's Rights Convention was held in Worcester, Massachusetts, and organized by Paulina Kellogg Wright Davis. This event attracted a crowd more than 1,000, both of men and women. Participants made speeches, heard letters from advocates, debated strategy, and presented resolutions. This event brought activists together and saw that people want to help them and that other people care about this conflict. The convention went so well that it continued for years. There was a multitude of women activists such as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. In 1866, these two women formed the American Equal Rights Association, which is dedicated to achieving the goal of suffrage for all, no matter what race or gender. The announcement of this group brought black, white, female, and male people together, and they were able to connect and relate to each other because everyone had the same goal. In 1868, a new issue is brought forth. The 14th Amendment is ratified, and it states that voters can only be male. This then leads to the debate whether black males are included. This ends up being the topic of most conversations, and the women's suffrage movement is slowed down. Because of this, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony found the National Women's Suffrage Association, which focuses on the women's suffrage movement instead of the male voting issue. This brought people back on track to achieving the goal of giving women the right to vote. After more gatherings, rallies, national women's rights conventions, speeches, and protesting, on December 10, 1869, the territory of Wyoming allows women the right to vote. The reason Wyoming allowed women the right to vote is in hope of bringing more women into the territory, because at the time there were only 6,000 men living in the area and only 1,000 women. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed and allowed black males the right to vote. Even though this was an excellent improvement to the United States, women were still getting quite agitated that they still could not vote. This was a very important event because it showed how far we have come from enslaving black people and terrorizing them to finally accepting them as equals. This proves that there is hope that women and men can be treated as equals as well. 2 years later, Susan B. Anthony casts her ballot for Ulysses S. Grant in the presidential election and is arrested along with 15 other women who tried to vote. Today, this would seem ridiculous for having someone arrested for voting, but back then this was what the government decided was best because they didn't think women should be allowed to vote. In 1878, the Women's Suffrage Amendment draft is proposed to the U.S. Congress. The bill is then taken to the Senate and is sadly defeated. From 1890 to 1925 is known as the Progressive Era. During this time, women from every class and background enter public life. The issue of women's suffrage becomes a part of mainstream politics. In 1893, Colorado gives women the right to vote. Every time a state gives women the right to vote, these people, women and men, feel that they really have accomplished something after years and years of work and trying. A year later, in 1894, 600,000 signatures were presented to the New York State Constitutional Convention in hopes of getting votes to make a women's suffrage amendment. Sadly, in the end, it failed, but men and women of all colors do not give up. By 1896, Utah joins the United States and allows women to vote along with Idaho. This is proof that all of the fighting to give women the right to vote is beginning to get results. Later in 1910, Washington State gives women the right to vote. Also that year, the Women's Political Union organizes the first ever suffrage parade. This was taking place in New York City. This was a major event because it was the first parade. In the end, it was proven successful because more people joined the cause. In 1912, women's suffrage is supported for the first time at the national level by a major political party. This was Theodore Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party. This was important because women's suffrage is being supported by a person who is running for president. The same year, 20,000 suffrage supporters joined a New York City suffrage parade. Also, Oregon, Kansas, and Arizona adopt women's suffrage. This is the most states to adopt women's suffrage in 1 year so far. 1913 rolls around, and suffragists organize a parade down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. The parade was the first major suffrage parade organized by the National American Woman Suffrage Association. This parade forces the government to see and hear the suffragists since they paraded outside the White House. A year later, Montana and Nevada adopt women's suffrage. It brings the men and women who fought so hard and tried so many ways to get women the right to vote so much joy when states respond to them and help their cause. Then, in 1915, 40,000 people march in a New York City suffrage parade. Most women are dressed in white and carry place cards with the names of the states they represent. This shows that women from all over the United States are willing to support this cause. Even though so many states have given women the right to vote, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and Massachusetts continue to reject women's suffrage. Later in 1916, Jeannette Rankin of Montana is the first woman to be elected into the House of Representatives. This event shows people that the world is changing and women's suffrage is possible. By 1917, New York women gained suffrage, and Kansas women are allowed to vote in primary elections. Voting in a primary election was a huge improvement and a confidence booster because this proved that if Kansas was willing to allow women to vote in an important election, then other states can do so as well. In 1918, Representative Rankin opens debate on a suffrage amendment in the House. The amendment passes. However, the amendment fails to win the required 2/3 majority in the Senate. That same year, Michigan, South Dakota, and Oklahoma adopt women's suffrage. Also, President Woodrow Wilson states his support for a federal women's suffrage amendment. He also addresses the Senate about adopting women's suffrage at the end of World War I. This event is important because the president says he is going to support women's suffrage, and with all of his government power, he can really help the amendment get ratified. Finally, in 1919, the Senate passes the 19th Amendment and the ratification process begins. On August 26, 1920, the government finally compromised, and 3/4 of the state legislators ratified the 19th Amendment. Finally, women have the right to vote. After about 70 years, women and men finally got the results they had been working so hard for and wanting so desperately. If this amendment wasn't passed and no one fought for women getting the right to vote, then today's society would be very different. Women would not have much power at all. It is a terrible thing to think that women had to go through this just because men were thought to be better.